everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Grand Rounds webinar on gene replacement therapy in practice, considerations, and case studies in process. I'm going to introduce our three presenters today, Dr. Bo Lee with the University of Rochester Medical Center, Natalie Goedeker with Washington University in St. Louis, and Erin Collins with the University of Rochester Medical Center.
The objectives of the talk today are as follows. So we're going to hopefully be able to go through some of the infrastructural needs when considering administering gene replacement therapies. We will identify specific opportunities for your teams, your care teams to support patients who are looking to and seeking gene replacement therapy for right now, we'll predominantly refer to SMA and Duchenne muscular dystrophy therapies. And we will also talk about anticipating additional infrastructure needs for potential gene replacement therapies coming in the future for other neuromuscular diseases, as well as give a couple of resources to help integrate this into practice. Let me advance the slide. So this is just an overview of the program agenda. We'll talk about why we're here, talk about the practicalities of getting gene replacement therapy set up in your institution. We each will discuss some case studies and sort of go through our workflow. And at the end, we're hoping to have some discussion about how the processes differ for other neuromuscular disorders, including sort of trying to compare SMA and DMD and our experiences so far with those. And we'll have time at the end, hopefully, for some question and answer sessions. So we're hoping that you are here because your institution or you are part of a team that's interested in becoming either a gene replacement therapy administration site, or you're already doing it and have other process questions, or want to learn about how processes work in other institutions. We will briefly kind of can touch on clinical trial sites and becoming a clinical trial site for gene replacement therapy clinical trials. And also this is for any clinician and administrative staff who is involved in any capacity in patient care for gene replacement therapy.
So just to kind of start off our thinking and our framework for this talk, we wanted to present this case on a 5-year-old with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, potentially sort of the impetus why some people may be particularly interested in this webinar. So family is presenting to clinic and they want to discuss some treatment options for their son with newly diagnosed Duchenne. They are new to town. They just moved from out of state. Mom and dad are still trying to figure out their situation. They're looking for work, and right now they're living with family. And their son was diagnosed at another clinic, and so we don't have records for them. We don't know his genetic mutation, but he is taking daily steroids. And now that they heard there's something called gene therapy for DMD, and they want to know what are the next steps, what's that medicine all about, and how can we get it for him? And we can go to the next slide, please. So to back up a little bit, just to briefly, this may be review for many people here or maybe not, but we just wanted to briefly touch on some of the terminology related to gene therapy. So gene therapy is an all-encompassing term, and it involves the modification or use of genetic material to treat a disease. And depending on what the issue is, what's causing the disease, gene therapy can involve replacing a missing or a mutated gene to therefore be able to then produce the missing protein. We can add genes to treat the disease, kind of same concept. We can turn off genes that are causing problems, that are making, too much of a detrimental protein, for example, or we can edit the existing gene so that that gene that's currently in the person's body can improve function. So what we are focusing on today, thinking of all of these various approaches, is specifically gene replacement therapy. But there also are these other terms, RNA therapy and also gene editing. But we really wanted to focus on gene replacement therapy for neuromuscular disease because those are the kind of two of the available products right now that might be a little bit difficult to procure and kind of implement in the clinic setting. And we wanted to talk about our experiences with those things. So this is giving an overview, again, touching on why we wanted to talk about this today. So gene replacement therapy is really emerging, and we have two currently approved therapies, but this is something that could potentially kind of explode for lots of rare neuromuscular diseases within the next 5 to 10 years. So right now, approved in May of 2019, the first systemic approved gene replacement therapy was Zolgensma, approved in the US for use in spinal muscular atrophy up to age 2. We don't have the clinical trials listed here, but there actually are some still ongoing clinical trials for gene replacement therapy with that same product. There's a trial that just completed called the SMART study, which was looking at IV Zolgensma in heavier children up to 21 kilograms. And we actually dosed, so kind of then if we're looking at heavier kids, in all likelihood, we're looking at older children. So we dosed a 4-year-old here, for example, with IV Zolgensma through that trial about 1.5 years ago. And data has just been released on that. There also are 2 ongoing trials for intrathecal Zolgensma, so giving Zolgensma via spinal tap to children ages, I believe, 2 to 17. One of which is for treatment-naive patients who have not had any other medication for their SMA, and then the other for patients who've discontinued an approved therapy. So those are ongoing, potentially could expand the label depending on the data for SMA, which would then greatly expand the potential for treating with that product. And then Duchenne muscular dystrophy, this product Elevidys was approved in June for children ages 4 to 5 with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Again, ongoing trials, as you can see on the right, with different constructs from different companies. And Sarepta is also continuing to study this particular product Elevidys in different age groups, including non-ambulatory boys. So also potential for a label expansion there, or for one of these other products to gain approval and be approved for a wider range of boys with DMD, which would, again, kind of ramp up how busy we all are going to be giving this medication. And then you can see lots of ongoing trials for gene replacement therapy in Pompe disease, for different forms of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and then a trial that's currently paused for X-linked myotubular myopathy. And so now I think I am going to transfer it over to Erin.
Thank you. So it looks like we do have a good mix in the audience of physicians, nurses, coordinators, genetic counselors, with the majority of people from centers who are currently administering the pediatric gene therapy, but with some centers who are planning to implement in the future. Unsurprisingly, many of you are experiencing challenges with patient access and insurance approval process. So hopefully today's presentation will help to shed some light on these areas of concern and spark discussion for things that will be useful to your programs. So for those of you on the call who are from institutions that are not yet set up to administer gene replacement therapy, it's important for you to start having discussions with the key stakeholders identified on this slide as soon as possible. We've come to realize that having these conversations early on about the needs from each team is beneficial. We found that initiating these discussions within your institutions as soon as you know about a potential product launch has been helpful in the overall success of our program. Many times, depending on the volume of patients that are expected with each therapy, you may need to increase staff in certain areas. So communicating as early on as possible is key. Make sure that you are being transparent with your internal team, and then as well as hospital leadership about the needs that are associated with these therapies and the potential increased workload for each department pre and post therapy. With the administration or the hospital leadership team, it's a necessity to discuss the budget planning, the financial burden or prospects, ensuring that there is infusion and procedure suite space and staffing available that will be allocated to this need. Within the neuromuscular care team, it's important that everyone is educated on the product upon launch, as they will quickly need to become experts in this therapy and develop a specialized or designated team that will handle the gene therapy cases. Because again, this will just help streamline the process and improve communications within the group. It's necessary that we define the roles and responsibilities within the neuromuscular team so that when the medication is in practice, or the medication or therapy is in practice, the team is aware of who is responsible for each step of the patient's journey, so that we help to eliminate any oversight or redundancy within the process. Identifying the group or groups within your institution who will navigate the financial risks associated with these high-cost therapeutics is also extremely important. As you know, these oftentimes are major areas of concern for many institutions. So it's important that we know who's responsible for reviewing the patient's benefits, the out-of-pocket costs, prior authorizations, and that this team is trained and educated and very diligent with their work. Some institutions may want to explore single case agreements with the payer to ensure that reimbursement rates are appropriate. So have some discussions with the hospital leadership to identify who will be responsible for this. And then from a pharmacy standpoint, it's important to find out, does this new therapeutic need to be reviewed by pharmacy leadership, by hospital leadership? Does it need to be added to the hospital's formulary? Does it need to be reviewed by the hospital's P&T committee? Figure out from your hospital leadership and or pharmacy team the preference on the procurement process, whether we will be getting the drug from a wholesaler through the buy and bill model, or if they would prefer that it come white bag through an outside specialty pharmacy. Also, from the pharmacy standpoint, important to have discussions about whether the pharmacy team will have a designated group that's responsible for ordering, obtaining the drug, appropriately storing the drug when it arrives, as well as a designated group that prepares the medication day of. Sometimes the institution may want to have this designated team just to ensure that all the appropriate staffing is in place the day of the shipment, and that there is enough space for storage of this therapeutic. Also, for the infusion site, it's important that we have these conversations with the nurse manager and the administration, the administrator of the team, to make sure that we do have enough space and there's an appropriate number of nursing staff to take on this increased workload. Make sure that the nurses from the infusion suite are trained in administering the gene therapy, as well as any potential reactions. We've also found it helpful at our institution that to have the nursing staff be trained on the disease state as well as the drug, so that they are more familiar with the disease that they're treating. They might not have experience treating Duchenne or SMA or some of these other neuromuscular diseases. You can go to next slide, please. Well, as that loads, I can get started. As previously discussed, there are several important discussions that need to be had within the department when developing a gene therapy program. It's essential that we identify the key team members, including but not limited to the medical professionals who are going to be responsible for certain tasks, such as the enrollment forms, the exploration of benefits and prior authorization, reviewing payer policies, scheduling and coordinating all testing, office visits, and procedures required prior to the dosing, ordering the therapeutic and the coordination of the delivery and preparation of the therapeutic the day of administration, assisting the patient and the caretakers with any lodging and or transportation that may be needed pre and post administration, and then identifying the resources that will assist families with any of the financial burden associated with bringing them here to your center for several visits ongoing. There also is a good amount of coordination needed when you are when looking at the post-dosing office visits, procedures, testing, the patients may need to uproot for a while as to get closer to one of these specialized centers. So ensuring that we have someone who's coordinating and helping the patient and their caretakers and families through this process is important. You can go to the next slide. So when there's a patient who identified as a potential gene therapy candidate, our clinicians are having the conversations with the patient and their family and the caretakers about the potential treatment options at that very first visit. During the appointment, we are also having the patient and their caretakers complete the paperwork that will enroll them in the pharmaceutical company's hub service program. These programs vary by the company, but the enrollment forms are important because they will register the patient with their services and generate a patient ID, which will then allow us to order the therapy. And then it also allows the patient access to numerous resources from the manufacturer, everywhere from the insurance exploration to copay assistance to nursing education. Something that our center has found to be helpful is setting the expectation to the patients and the families when they come to our center for the very first visit. Many people are very eager to start this therapy, but it's important that they understand the complexities of this therapy and making sure that we're setting the expectations that this is a process. It does take time, and unfortunately, it is normal for this to be pretty time consuming. Something that we've found to keep us in line throughout the process is having a checklist that we keep in the patient's chart that will allow us to track the status of lab work, procedures, tests, prior authorization status. You can go to next slide. So once the patient has established care within our center and it's time to submit the prior authorization, it's important that the prior authorization is going to the insurance company with all necessary information. It can be helpful for the team to or whoever's responsible for submitting the authorization to review the patient's payer policy prior to submitting the authorization and include a cover sheet that highlights why the patient meets the policy and or FDA label. If you're having a hard time finding the payer policy, this could be a good time to lean on your institution's contracting team or the manufacturer's representatives to see if they have access to it. If the patient does fit the criteria for this policy, ensuring that you're highlighting and even bullet pointing why they do, and if they do not meet the criteria for the policy, go back to the prescribing information and highlight why the patient meets the FDA label. If the payer denies coverage, there typically will be a next step highlighted in the denial packet, but if it's not included in the denial, you can call the plan to find out what the next steps would be. We've seen some instances of self-funded plans where the employer does exclude coverage of the gene therapy and or other expensive therapeutics. Sometimes with these, there are appeal options and other times there's not. Some state Medicaid plans will cover and other times they won't. Some plans will allow for an appeal process and other times they won't. So unfortunately, this is not a clear-cut path and there's really no black and white answer across the board of what the correct solution will be. But sometimes there are, one of the representatives within the manufacturing group or someone from the institution's contracting team may be able to reach out to the payer leadership to see if there are any options available. So there is the buy and bill model refers to the institutions where you purchase from a wholesaler and provide the therapy to a patient in office, and then the institution bills the insurance company directly for the medication, whereas the white bagging model is the practice of a patient's drug being sent to the hospital from an outside specialty pharmacy. Some examples of these are getting it through Accredo or CVS Specialty, Optum. Those might be names that you've heard. It's important to know if your institution prefers that you acquire these therapies via buy and bill, or if they prefer to use the white bag model. In some instances, the payer will require that it come from a preferred specialty pharmacy. But as long as you work with the institution's hospital leadership and pharmacy team, for the most part, you would be able to establish this prior to submitting for prior authorization.
I'm going to talk about this slide. So I'm gonna just talk a little bit about some considerations when preparing for the assessment of a patient pursuing gene therapy and touch a little bit on kind of navigating the patient side of the journey as well. So depending on the case, the family may already be established within a center, or maybe presenting as a new diagnosis, or in the case of SMA, a newborn screen identified new patient. And it's important for care, obviously, to be established, and that should include lots of baseline assessments, exam, evaluation of other relevant systems, like cardiac and respiratory status. You don't want to be post-administration with abnormal troponins and not have the information on what the child's baseline cardiac function was or status was. It's also generally advised, and I'm sure this is the case at most centers, that you have a pre-established relationship with your subspecialist so that they're aware of the planned treatment for gene therapy and possible adverse events. So for us, we met with our liver team, we met with cardiology, and place not only to just notify and say we need baseline, and but to have a plan for should there be an abnormality, who is our first point of contact, what's the availability for urgent evaluations, etc. Care coordination is a huge part of the patient experience and journey, obviously. So, and families will have varying needs for nursing support, social work support, transportation support, and financial assistance for the other costs related to receiving gene therapy. It's not just the coverage of the drug. And then safety must be thought about at every point along the way in the entire journey. This includes, as Erin mentioned, a checklist of baseline labs, ensuring that there's no underlying conditions that are going to preclude safe treatment. And that's something that we review over and over again leading up to therapy. No recent or active illnesses around the time of treatment, and so some anticipatory guidance around that. Reviewing recommendations for vaccinations or holding vaccinations. And then really, I think it's very important that the treatment team and the family have a mutual understanding of the risks, of course, but a commitment from the family and caregivers to adhere to the follow-up recommendations. And I've heard people kind of think about gene therapy similarly to like the process of transplantation, where even though the actual event of receiving the drug or the transplant might occur just over one day, there's a lot of pre-planning and post-monitoring that needs to be done. And so making sure that families understand and commit to those processes. And can we go to the next slide? So depending on your hospital, there are some administration considerations to think about as well. So the physical administration of gene therapy can differ. At our center, both SMA and Duchenne gene replacement is administered in our pediatric outpatient infusion center, and that's located within our main hospital building. So it would be relatively close to the pediatric ED as well as the pediatric hospital, should there be any need for that. The location certainly could have impact on insurance authorization. For example, inpatient versus outpatient infusions are not going to be authorized in the same way. And then you'll need to work with the location, the infusion location, to make sure that they can accommodate the volume of patients that you anticipate in the time frame that's necessary. Other things to plan and think about and talk about with the infusion center is the estimated duration of the infusion. That should be understood, and this needs to include time for the patient to arrive, have baseline labs or vitals checked if needed, for vascular access to be obtained, time for the pharmacy to thaw and prep the drug. Once the patient is okayed on that day to receive the drug, nursing comfort for administration, and then it's always a good idea to have some contingency planning. Or, for example, our protocol in Rochester is to place 2 IVs in case access is lost mid-infusion. That hasn't happened, but we like to have that sort of extra layer of security so that there's not a long pause or delay mid-infusion. And so as you can see, there's this theme of coordinated planned efforts and lots of communication that needs to occur across all divisions. I'm going to hand this back off to Natalie.
All right, so getting back to that first slide, going back to this 5-year-old with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So when we're thinking about answering the parent's question, how can we get them gene therapy? We first have to think about whether this child is a candidate for gene therapy. So what is his genetic mutation? Does he have antibodies to the viral vector used in the product? And is he otherwise healthy? So there's a whole host of labs and cardiac testing that we would have to do at baseline to ensure that he's even a candidate. As Dr. Lee mentioned, gene replacement therapy is not one and done. And so that's sort of the concept, and when we're teaching families about it, is that it kind of is one and done, and that, you know, we give it to them, it becomes a part of them. We cannot remove it later. We can't just stop it. If there's a side effect, we have to manage the side effect as we can with immune suppressive medications or, you know, whatever supportive care we can give, but we can't take it away. But it's not one and done, and that they come and get their IV and get the infusion and leave and can just disappear. And so we have to make sure that it's a reliable family who's really going to be compliant with everything that we ask them to do. And our process is to have conversations at multiple time points, so not just at the office visit, but we are talking to them once all of these labs come back and going through everything that they have to do and all of the potential side effects again, and doing so at least a third time when we're prescribing their add-on steroids, so that it really it's enforced to them the importance of what they need to do and why. And, you know, also for our sake, so that we are having good, solid documentation for all the education that we've provided to them. And so what are the risks of therapy? We have some of the known risks that are outlined here when we're talking about ELEVIDYS. Not really going to get into these in specific detail because it's not the purpose of this, although I do think that it is worth mentioning the thought behind this cannot just be, can my institution procure this medication? For us, since we've been doing this for a while and have been administering gene replacement therapy, you know, from the time of Zolgensma, the easy part is sort of the procurement, although it is a lot of work to kind of get the infrastructure up and running. But the challenge is not, definitely not the infusion day. That's the easy part. The hard part comes after, with the monitoring, the nuances of the monitoring, and management of these particular side effects and the unknown risks that can happen with gene therapy. As happened with Zolgensma, there were a number of side effects that have come up post-marketing that were not seen in the clinical trials. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we do all of the further testing, and we determine that this 5-year-old is a candidate for ELEVIDYS. He turns 6 years old in about 4 months or so. So we, at this point in time, have kind of a restricted time frame in which to administer this product. And parents want to pursue the medication and want to know next steps. And so I just kind of wrote out here in a very linear way how exactly we go through the process. I'm not going to go through all these things because I think they have already been discussed. But as I mentioned, for number 1, looking at the family commitment, again, we do that at multiple time points throughout this process, in person and over the phone, including on the infusion day itself. Our institution's process at Washington University in St. Louis is to obtain and document verbal consent. So we don't have a written consent for gene therapy, although other institutions, Dr. Lee, I don't know if you guys have a written consent. I know that some people have decided to go that way. We did not. It's quite complicated here with a legal kind of getting things like that up and running. So our process is to document verbal consent at multiple time points. And then as Erin has gone over these other steps, you know, it's very linear in terms of how this goes. We get all of the testing done first and make sure that we have everything on file that we think may be needed before we submit to the insurance company, because we don't want the insurance company to come back and say, well, you didn't check this lab and that's on the label, because that's on us and that's a delay that's on us. And so we make sure that we have everything in place in a pretty regimented way. Once we have the prior authorization in place, our site does buy and bill. And so in general, we do the single case agreements. There are some exceptions. For our institution, for example, has a agreement with Medicaid in our state. And so we don't have to get a case agreement if a child is on Medicaid. It makes things much simpler. But once the pieces are in place in terms of the PA and the case agreement, if needed, we then are rechecking a weight. Even in these Duchenne boys, that is our process. Even though they're a little bit older, we're not dosing newborns who are rapidly gaining weight. We still have decided we want to get as close to the accurate dose as we can. So we're rechecking a weight and then immediately ordering drug, which goes through our pharmacy purchasing. And then, of course, we schedule the infusion and again go over what the family has to do, prescribe the steroids. Our process for ELEVIDYS is also to provide the family with some Zofran at home, since we know that half or a little bit more of the boys are going to have some vomiting. We like for them to just have it on hand. We also, since they are on high-dose steroids, we just at baseline start them on some sort of GI prophylaxis. Not everybody does that. You certainly don't have to, but we've decided to do that since they're taking a higher dose of steroids for a couple of months. The infusion day, as I mentioned, is the easy part. We are examining the patients prior to prepping the drug, because we don't want to pop some vials that are $3.2 million and then find out that Timmy is vomiting or otherwise sick on that particular day. We also have decided to get some labs on the day of the infusion to kind of get a second set of sort of baseline, I suppose. So we're checking another troponin and a CNP and GGT on the infusion day itself. Although, again, that is optional and not part of the label. That is just our WashU process. One thing to mention that's a little bit different with Zolgensma is that the medication is kept in the freezer and not in the fridge. And so while we have the requirement right now to examine the patient prior to prepping the drug, that really delays things. So Zolgensma, it's pretty quick. We examine the child and they, pharmacy takes the drug out of the fridge, and it probably takes about an hour or so to make it to the bedside. This really prolongs things, our requirement to examine the patient prior, because the drug is coming out of the freezer and then has to thaw, and that can take some number of hours. And then, as I wrote here, then for us, the real work starts, which is the following and follow-up and ongoing monitoring of the labs and talking to the family. So to back up again a little bit further, how do we accomplish getting this product at our site to begin with? So, I mean, going back a few years, we had experience with Zolgensma, but Dr. Lee is going to talk about that a little bit more. So specific to ELEVIDYS, we did participate in the clinical trials here. So we have dosed over 20 boys, which gives us some comfort and actually gives us some anxiety, because we know what we have to anticipate and the work that's involved and the potential for unknown and new side effects, as I mentioned, and potential for severe side effects. So that's never the hope, but we know that that's the possibility. Also, because of our experience with Zolgensma, we involved key stakeholders probably about a year, maybe a little bit less prior to drug approval, but that is about how long it takes to get a product like this up and running at our institution. We had lots of ongoing meetings with our finance team, our managed care team, our pharmacy team, even our, similar to Dr. Lee's site, we administer this at our outpatient infusion center. So we have the management from there on these meetings and talk about the different things that all these different departments have to consider. I just noted on here some early challenges that we have had since this product has been approved. First of all, this is just off the cuff, but we have had a larger number of boys be antibody positive than has been reported in the clinical trials, and it's probably just our sample. That's, of course, that's the hope. But that's precluded a number of our boys from being treated. We are having a lot of issues with insurance authorization that we have not necessarily seen with the SMA drugs. So denials due to the idea that this medication is experimental, or companies are wanting to see the phase 3 data that's going to be coming out later this year, early next year. So we've had that happen in several patients in spite of our best efforts to get that overturned. Dr. Lee and I talked a little bit about this earlier this week, and you're welcome to jump in if you'd like, but we shared the initial concern that prior to knowing this drug was going to be limited to 4 to 5-year-olds, we were worried about the possibility of the initial influx of patients and how we were going to manage potentially treating all ambulatory boys with Duchenne safely and efficiently. And how we were going to decide, you know, potentially who gets treated first and who maybe has to wait a few months. Also, you know, the issue is not just the ability, as I said, to procure and administer the product, it's to monitor all of these ongoing labs and potential side effects. And so at our site, one kind of very practical thing is that when we send children to an outside lab that doesn't flow into our electronic medical record, which is Epic, we just get these labs sort of scanned in. And so we'll be reviewing sometimes like 6 individual labs. We'll have the CNP scanned in, and then we'll have the troponin scanned in, and then the GGT is scanned in. So we'll get all of these labs for these patients with not an easy way at all to trend week to week. And so we made the decision for this product that the boys were going to have to go to a lab that utilizes Epic as the medical record, so we can easily trend and manage them. And that's kind of one rule that we made, with potential for some exceptions. Of course, we have a lot of rural patients where maybe it's just not possible. So we're not going to tell them they can't get gene therapy just for that reason, but that's our soft rule, I guess. And then for this product, I put on here an early challenge is ordering and patient wait. It's taking quite a bit longer than Zolgensma to order and get this medication. Zolgensma we can get in 48 hours. This is taking weeks. And so just figuring out timing of patient wait and scheduling has been a little bit more challenging, especially for boys who are kind of borderline in the weight class. I already mentioned the drug prep for the freezer versus the fridge, so I'm not going to touch on that. And then, of course, post-administration, there's some unique safety monitoring challenges for Duchenne, including that boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy can have troponin leak, and so they can have fluctuating troponin I values just because of their Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and yet we are using that as a post-drug, toxicity marker, and so that is a challenge. Also, AST and ALT are generally not high in boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy because of their muscle disease, and we are using those to help us determine if they are having liver-related toxicity. And then the cardiac monitoring I just put on here because of the possibility if there's an abnormal troponin value, we need to figure out how quickly we need to act on that value. Our site, what we have decided to do, we talked with our heart team, and we have a heart failure team that will see patients same day or within 24 hours who agreed to kind of be on call for these boys if they have a troponin that we're concerned about, but they're asymptomatic. They will accommodate our boys same day in clinic and decide what's needed, if anything, in terms of further workup or treatment for that. I'll pass it back to Dr. Lee.
So I don't think I need to go into exact detail on this because it's very similar to Dr. Goedeker's process at her institution, but this is kind of an example of the best case scenario operational workflow for the onboarding process at our institution for SMA patients for gene therapy. I think one of the biggest differences between the DMD case that Dr. Goedeker went over and our case is that we are tentatively scheduling patients for the treatment as soon as we're getting that positive newborn screening test result. We're trying to schedule patients for about 2 to 3 weeks out from the initial newborn screening flag. And then if there's any hurdles along the way, such as like an elevated AAV or abnormal test result, or an issue with the insurance process, we're communicating with the infusion suite, just like throughout the whole entire process to get it postponed. The SMA cases that we've seen so far have been a bit easier to get approved, and it usually has a quicker turnaround. So the insurance process with that medication or with that therapeutic is not as challenging. Something to mention in our state is that in New York is that newborn screening flags any baby with 0 copies of the SMN1 gene and then also provides the SMN2 copy number. We still send for confirmatory testing at the same time that we're sending the AAV antibody testing, but I know that differs for some states. And then Dr. Lee, I don't know if you have anything else to add for this.
No, I think in the interest of time too, we can just go to the next slide. And this is sort of meant to summarize some of the process differences between DMD and SMA. So just to review before opening up to questions and discussion, while it was very helpful, of course, to have had the experience with getting SMA gene replacement therapy well established, there are key process differences and then medical differences. And at this point, the majority of new SMA diagnoses eligible for gene replacement therapy are going to be identified by newborn screen. And as Erin just mentioned, there's an urgency to treatment. So there's a lot of coordination that has to occur in a very relatively short amount of time. I think there's also this sort of increasing risk, maybe especially with those high SMN2 copy number babies, the 4 copies and up, for loss to follow-up over time because many of them develop normally. And so it's, again, very important to establish that mutual understanding that this is a long-term relationship, even though it's a one-day infusion. And then for Duchenne, we currently have the 1 approved product with the restricted age range, but like Natalie had mentioned, many centers, when they were gearing up for the anticipated approval, had to consider some unique challenges for Duchenne. And some of the things that we certainly considered at our site was how quickly we could treat as many boys as we can while maintaining safety. So our planning meetings started similarly in that time frame, about a year before there was approval and FDA approval, but trying to avoid an issue, any issue of like rare resource allocation. Like many other centers, we just tried to anticipate various scenarios and plan through potential administrative bottlenecks, including not knowing what the payer coverage was going to look like. And then we also I wanted to mention one last thing, which is that we wanted to be equitable about that access. So of course, when Elevidys was approved, we had people who had already been calling us, and the more medically savvy and well connected families, but also making sure that we were reaching and thinking about the patients who were not able to do that, or were not as well connected, or as well versed in what was happening on the research side and what was coming. Can move on to, I think, the next slide.
So this could be an easy or a hard one to address, because it sounds like there's a lot of issues trying to implement gene replacement therapy into practice. What is the biggest challenge you've encountered when implementing GRT at your institution?
I don't know if I have a number one thing that I could mark as the biggest challenge. I think one of the things that is difficult is that there's a lot of things that you have to anticipate and plan for, and because you don't want to be stuck in a scenario where you're post-treatment and faced with a scenario that you're not sure what to do about. So I think that has been one of the things that we spend lots and lots of time on in all these pre-implementation meetings, is that trying to make sure that we are as inclusive as possible about the what ifs.
Yeah, and it sounds like that feeds into the second question listed. I think I heard Natalie describe this earlier too. What's the best advice you can give to institutions looking to start? Dr. Lee, you said, think of case scenarios, like work through what if situations. And Natalie, if I could put words in your mouth, I think you have said start early, or maybe you said that at some point in discussion.
Yeah, and I think also to reach out to places, if it's a new place who hasn't done it or has only given Zolgensma once or twice, sites who have done it more frequently. I mean, we are here and happy to answer questions, and we often field questions from smaller sites in the region, and we are more than happy to do that. We consider it a professional, sort of duty to help, and we're happy to pass questions and answers back and forth. So please reach out if needed.
And then I know if I don't want to scroll back and share my screen through the audience poll, but I know that one of the top concerns among institutions who are already administering gene replacement therapies, mostly in pediatrics, they had some of their rationale for joining today was to learn about the challenges experienced by others who are administering at their institutions. And one of those challenges is the access. Is there anything more that you'd like to share about your experience where you said, I know, Erin, you had mentioned that there's not, it's kind of a gray zone. There's no hard and fast rule. Is there anything else you'd like to add at this point for people who are having trouble having their patients get access to these therapies?
I think the biggest thing is to keep fighting, be diligent, keep at it. A lot of times it feels like these payers are just putting hurdles for us to jump through. So I think just continually, appealing to the highest level that you can. If you do get a denial, call the insurance company and ask what the next steps are. Reach out to resources within your institution, reach out to resources outside of your institution, reach out to the manufacturers, that there are people available to help. So I think just being diligent and pushing back on the payers is the biggest thing you can do. Unfortunately, I don't think there really is like a magic solution, but keep at it.
Yeah, I agree. Being pesky, and families also, at some point in the process can call themselves. And we've had a couple instances where that has evidently been quite helpful to have the family kind of, we don't ever put that on the family, but if they want to get involved, they can, and sometimes it might be helpful.
Okay. And then finally, going back to one of the first 5 slides, I think, we know that there are a lot of additional therapies being investigated now. When you think about those trials and some of the challenges that you might have to face, what do you think are the key challenges with some of these other disease states? We know that SMA differs from DMD, and you've done an excellent job of highlighting for us some of those challenges that we're experiencing now. But do you have a sort of view into the future of anything that stands out to you with some of the other neuromuscular diseases?
I think that there's probably like sort of 2 umbrellas of challenges. The first being every disease is different, and so and every drug is going to be different with different side effect profile and safety monitoring. So depending on the frequency of that follow-up schedule, that would change what the implementation might look like. And then I think, as we've seen with both the SMA product and the DMD product, and maybe a little bit more with the DMD product as it was an accelerated approval, that we just don't know until it's approved and we start looking through insurance policies. We just don't know whether it's going to be a major barrier, medium barrier, or no barrier.
Makes sense. So you won't know until you see the approved label. But you imagine that insurance coverage will continue to be a challenge. So we have 2 slides here. One is resources for clinicians, so you can look at some of the key sources that of the information presented are listed here, as well as the ASGCT website. MDA does have clinical learning modules coming soon that sort of help break down each of these aspects, checklists and things like that. That's coming soon, so be on the lookout for those. And then 2 links for the sponsored clinical support for clinicians, and then some resources to be available to perhaps share with your patients. MDA does have a gene therapy community support. These are downloadable materials. You might share these with your patients to help them as you have conversations. As the panel just discussed, communication with the patient is a key part of this gene therapy process, this relationship. So we hope that you'll find those helpful in your conversations. Again, the ASGCT has an excellent patient education resource. And then Erin has done a fantastic job of pulling together some of these patient access programs that she's found useful. And then on a final note, just stay tuned for more continuing education opportunities. This is CE accredited. We offer CE accredited and non-accredited programs. And to make sure you're aware of the resources that we are putting out there, please ensure you're subscribed to the monthly report. And you can get that through going to mda.org/meded. And that's it. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you so much for your insights, panelists, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs and engaging with you. So have a wonderful day.